This is Chris Time Steele, and this episode of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network, features my friend Seth Tobocman, who is a legendary artist who was part of the collective World War III. He's known for his graphic novels and comics from titles such as Freedom of the Press in Black and White, The Story of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a Black Reporter, You Don't Have to Fuck People Over to Survive, War in the Neighborhood, which was just released by Ad Astra Comics, Disaster and Resistance, and his latest, Len, about radical attorney Leonard Weinglass. I've known Seth for a couple of years, and Seth did an album cover for one of my collab albums titled How to Sew Wounds with Words, and I had the pleasure of meeting him in Brooklyn and got to work on some stencils with him for a protest that they were organizing about the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. Seth comes from a whirlwind of contradictions and a family history of communists, capitalists, and college professors. Seth Tobocman is an artist who lets the suffering speak. Akin to works by artists such as Franz Mazariel and Lynn Ward, Tobocman's work, War in the Neighborhood, which was first released in 1999, gives readers a first-hand experience of the squatter movement in the Lower East Side of New York in the 1980s. War in the Neighborhood's a 300-plus page epic, and it takes readers into the world of police violence, informants, the struggle of experiencing homelessness, resistance, autonomous organizing, and the power of direct action. In this episode, we talked about art and gentrification, his experience in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the squatting movement, police violence, landlords, Hurricane Katrina, mutual aid, and foreign policy. I recently started a Patreon for Time Talks. Any support is much appreciated. And once again, shout out to Awareness for the music. Here's a short clip for the podcast The Soulcast from my good friend Soul, part of the Channel Zero Network.
We are at war!
The Soulcast is a twice-a-month anarchist podcast hosted by North American rap artist Soul. It's a podcast about revolutionary politics from an anarchist perspective. Every month I interview academics, journalists, revolutionaries, quote-unquote activists, artists, musicians, and really anything that I find interesting. I never got to go to college, so this is my cheat sheet. So anybody who wants to learn, you can learn with me. Subscribe in iTunes at tinyurl.com/Soulcast and check it out on the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
We are
Hello.
at war!
Hey, Seth. So my first question was if you could talk about the tensions of gentrification of when you first went into the Lower East Side and how you used solidarity with the community.
Sure. When I got to New York City, that was in the 70s, and that was at the height of, I came to New York City in 1976, at the same time as what they called the bicentennial of the United States, and that was at the beginning of the financial crisis of New York City, and I was in college and then dropped out of college, left the dorms, lived in Greenwich Village, found I couldn't afford it, got forced out in a rather dirty trick by a roommate, pretty much subbed me out the door. Didn't know a person could do that. I learned that, and I actually slept in Washington Square Park for a couple nights and got robbed. And eventually found this very inexpensive apartment on the Lower East Side through a friend who was moving out of it. That cost $150 a month. And at that time, people said, you're crazy to move there, because it was there was, open-air drug dealing on the block that I moved on to. There was like a line of people down the street to buy their drugs. And, it was a pretty heavy scene. There were a lot of abandoned buildings around. The building out back of the one I lived in was abandoned, and there was an empty lot full of rubble in between, and there was this huge cat that lived in that lot that was just covered in gray soot. And at one point when I got a cat, this cat came in to meet my cat, and it was like a pretty terrifying creature. It was fascinating, though, that I'd never seen a cat like that. So that's the neighborhood I moved into. It was a poor neighborhood. It was a neighborhood where there was a lot of crime. It was mostly Hispanic. But what I discovered really quickly was that the people in the neighborhood actually put a lot of energy into trying to make it livable. Like they had community gardens, they had community organizations like Charas or like the New Eurekan Poets Cafe, and they did a lot to try to make the neighborhood livable, in spite of being under this pressure from this continuous open-air drug dealing and the fact that local kids got drawn into that and they got killed, in conflicts over that. And also that, the people in the neighborhood, interestingly, they kind of viewed that from their point of view, which is very different than the way society articulates it, they viewed the cause of drugs and drug dealing and violence in the neighborhood as white people, because white people came in to buy. People from the suburbs came in to buy. Most of the business of the drug operation had nothing to do with anyone who lived around here, and the way I found to deal with anyone who tried to rob me was to make it very clear that I lived on the block, and when they figured that out, they would leave me alone.
Oh,
wow. And then I was part of a rent strike in my building, which got us onto rent stabilization, because when we came in, we were in another program. That program ended, and the landlord tried to put us into market rate, which would have meant very big increases for everyone. And we took the landlord to court and were able to prove that a number of things they did were illegal. And we got rent stabilization on this building, so that people have been here ever since, and most people have been able to stay, although their rent certainly increases every couple of years, but not at the rate that other people's rent increases. That was a really interesting experience. One thing I remember was that at the time I was kind of in and out of art school and never really finished art school, but I had a roommate who was in art school with me and who had big intentions for himself. And I remember I was we were having meetings with the Tenants Association in the hallway, and my roommate walked through the meeting, and he walked into the room. And when I came back into the apartment, he said, "What are you doing out there in the hallway with all those old people?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? That's the Tenants Association. We're trying to keep from being evicted." And he said, "You mean you want to stay here? I don't want to stay here. I'm going to be a successful artist, and I'm going to live in a penthouse like Picasso." So those are sort of the illusions that people had. Now, if he were to come back to New York today, he would fight and die to get an apartment like this, Yeah. But at the time, it seemed like this is this little hole. What are you doing here? So that was pre-gentrification Lower East Side. And then as the change started in the city, which really started with raids against the drug dealing, and then after that, a lot of property changing hands, the new problem for people came to be that they might be priced out of here. And so various campaigns and programs developed around that.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it kind of leads into my next question, where in War in the Neighborhood, you show community solidarity and struggle. I wanted if you could talk about the current condition of gentrification in Lower East Side and New York as a whole.
Well, okay. The Lower East Side has been absorbed into New York City, and New York City has, to a large extent, been absorbed into the United States of America. So, in a sense, there's not a Lower East Side to speak of, in the sense that there existed one when I moved here, that it felt like it was almost an autonomous community or a country in its own right, or a world in its own right that was really different than the rest of society, and that's not the case now. It's a really hard environment right now financially. I gosh, I don't know where to start. I think everybody knows this. It's really expensive to live around here now unless you have some special deal. And if you have that special deal, it's probably because you fought for it for years, like people who managed to get a squat legalized, or people who have rent-stabilized apartments that are, 10 or 15 years old, and therefore they pay a rent that is much lower than the person who just moved in. And otherwise, it's very expensive to live in New York City now, and even in most of Brooklyn and the Bronx, which I think is, in the long run, going to undermine what made New York City vital, which was that a young person could come here with nothing in their pocket and start out and try something a little bit different, and that's not going to be the case anymore. That I don't know how young people make these rents. I think that it's a real struggle for them. I see a lot of people living with a lot of people in one space. And actually, we did that when we were kids too, but we did that because we were only working like 1 or 2 days a week. It was hard to find work in 80. Very hard to find work. There's a lot more work, but they want a lot more money from you. And I think that, anytime there's a recession in the economy, it hits people really hard because there's nothing to fall back on. I think it's really rough, but what I do see is that, and another thing is that there used to be a lot of abandoned buildings and a lot of empty property in New York, and that's what made squatting possible. Whereas increasingly every imaginable bit of space has been used up and developed. So I think that makes the type of resistance we had in the 80s and 90s very difficult. But what I do see is that people have gotten organized around protecting rent stabilization, around preventing rent increases. I mean, this is the first time in the entire history of rent stabilization that we haven't had an increase in the legal rent for rent-stabilized tenants, because we have a mayor who was essentially elected by the tenant movement. And we have a mayor elected by the tenant movement because today most New Yorkers are afraid of their landlord, whereas 30 years ago most New Yorkers were afraid of being robbed by a drug dealer or a drug addict. So the big fear in New York, and fear really runs New York City politics, the big fear is the landlord. The landlord is the most dangerous person in your life today. And because of that, we have a mayor who says, I will protect you from the landlord. And to some extent, at least for older people, he does. I don't think that anything has been done for younger people, and I think that's a real problem in the city. That we don't have any type of rent protections for new tenants or any attempt to provide affordable housing to new tenants. And we don't have also any type of protection for small businesses, which are continually being forced to close. Like every time I walk up the street, there's some place I was used to going to that is gone, is closed, because the Supreme Court, I think they ruled in the 70s that the city could not regulate commercial rents. That was somehow unconstitutional. So commercial tenants have no rent control. So for all those reasons, there is a housing struggle in New York. It's much different than the old housing struggle. I think that, millennials have shown they have a lot of weight in electoral politics, a surprising amount of weight, and they ought to be in there trying to get some type of rent protection so that they're not forced out of the city. That's what I would advocate. There needs to be some type of protection, rent protection for new tenants, not just for people who've had an apartment for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, and places like Denver, I don't know if you know much about Denver, but we don't even have a rent control
right
here, and the gentrification is just, well, like most places, it's out of control, and there's a homeless camping ban in Denver now, which, if a blanket or a jacket counts as shelter now. So if someone puts a blanket on them in the winter out here, they get cited for camping. It's crazy. I know a lot of your newer work has been, you said, around climate change.
The new issue of the magazine is around climate change, and we're starting to work on those issues. And I'm active right now with a group called Sane Energy Project, who are fighting the development of fossil fuel infrastructure, not only fracking, but also pipelines that move frack gas around the country, and rail lines that move explosive trains full of gas through different neighborhoods, and starting to get an understanding of the fossil fuel infrastructure of the country, which is fascinating to me as an artist, just as like squatting sort of made one aware of, the substructure of your building, that, there's electrical meters, there's plumbing all the way through the building, what it does, how it works, how it relates to various agencies. Likewise, you drive down the highway, you see some weird piece of machinery with like flames coming out of the top. You don't think much about it. You don't know what it is, but starting to work with Sane, I've been, getting educated about that and looking at that and seeing exactly how much really dangerous and toxic stuff is around us all the time. It's pretty wild when you start to look at it.
Yeah, well, definitely. It's really cool. I like that, how all the pipelines and what you're talking about, how they all connect and the consequences. My other question was about the intersections that you saw with housing and losing housing between war in the neighborhood and then your work with disaster and resistance.
Oh, yeah. Hurricane Sandy. Okay. Yes. Or for that matter, Hurricane Katrina, which I was perhaps actually more involved in, oddly enough. One of the things that you saw with both Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy was that when a disaster like that hits an urban area, the people who are going to be most badly affected are the people who don't have financial resources. In Katrina, the people who were caught in the flood were the people who didn't have cars to drive out, so that it was almost entirely a low-income black population that was caught in the flood, because everybody else left. And then you have a lot of discrimination as to what gets rebuilt and how. And, you had a real struggle develop around, the right of poor people to come back into their neighborhood, and did they actually have any right in that situation whatsoever, And in New Orleans, they used the pretty much minor damage from Hurricane Katrina to public housing as an excuse to tear down public housing and to displace a large number of poor people out of the city and disperse them to other places. It was a very ugly battle, and we lost it. We did try to fight it, and I worked with groups of people who were trying to fight it, but to a large extent, that was lost in New Orleans, that public housing was destroyed. And, public housing has a terrible reputation in the United States because it's very badly run, but it's not such a bad idea. I mean, in places where the proper investment is made, public housing is a good thing, and is even something people seek after, And
did you work with the Common Ground Collective as
I worked with Common Ground in New Orleans, and I also worked with a group called the New Day Community Center, which was organizing tenants there. Yes, in fact, and I also put together a group of people from the Lower East Side where I brought skilled tradespeople who'd come out of the squatters movement, electricians and plumbers, to New Orleans, and we called that group the Lower East Side to New Orleans Caravan, because we all drove down together.
So the next question, I think you've kind of already answered it, but I wanted to talk about the relevance of why this book is so important. It's coming out now, again, being re-released.
Okay.
And I know you've talked about the lack of history that's been written of this time.
Yeah, well, okay, let's start with that. Let's start with what this book is. War in the Neighborhood is a book I produced after 5 or 6 years of being involved in the Lower East Side squatters movement. Lower East Side squatters movement was a movement where we broke into abandoned buildings and made them into housing for people. And we had a lot of abandoned buildings in the Lower East Side of New York and also in the Bronx to some extent in the 1980s and, going into the 90s. There were a lot of abandoned buildings, and they were owned by the city. People broke in, started converting those into housing, and then wound up having to fight with the city about the attempts of the city to evict people from those buildings. So that was about the right to a home and also about the right of communities to organize themselves. It also involved a conflict with liberal organizations who were connected to city government and connected to not-for-profits who envisioned some more legalized way of developing those properties as mixed-use housing. Usually something like 50-50 or even 80-20, 20% low income, 80% market rate, various tax abatements and various kickbacks to developers and politicians. So that was their way of helping the poor or, the moderate income or whatever, category was being used. So the squatters were also in the way of that. They were in conflict with a lot of different forces in the city. And so it was an experiment with direct democracy, with direct action, and with people's self-organization. And I think that it's relevant today in that, we're still talking a lot about people's self-organization, whether it's in the various occupied camps or communities organizing against fossil fuel infrastructure or in Black Lives Matter. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about people coming together, taking action, and being, to some extent, self-governing, and how that works. The same questions come up again and again. How do we make decisions, and, who makes those decisions? How democratic should we be? How do we resist the police and at the same time not start acting like police and landlords ourselves? So all of those things came up in the squatter movement and were fought through from different points of view by a very diverse and pretty crazy group of people. And when I sat down to write War in the Neighborhood, it was after a decade of being involved in that activity and feeling like, well, I had some experience that I could share with future generations of activists, of which there are plenty of activists now who might have use of this and might actually be able to make better use of this knowledge than I can.
Oh, well, that's exactly where I wanted to keep on going with and where you went. So I wanted to talk about resistance and protests and, the age of online petitions. I think in your story, it shows, Tompkins Square Park police riot of 1988. It shows the value of direct action. I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of how those tactics really benefited the squatting movement. And I love when Steve's dog says direct action gets the goods.
Yeah, okay. I think it's really important to see how this worked. People seized about 30 buildings, I would say. And of those 30, at the end of the process, about 13 of them were legalized and are now owned by the people who live in them. Okay, the rest were evicted or burned down or demolished. No question about it. On the other hand, the 13 buildings are housing about 500 people. The process by which that happened involved a real diversity of tactics. It involved people who would go to court. It involved people who would do nonviolent civil disobedience. It involved some violent self-defense against police. It involved people whose primary focus was construction work on the buildings and who did not engage in any type of politics at all, at least nothing that would be superficially understood as politics, and it involved people who just lived there, So it involved a lot of different people doing whatever that person felt was their best contribution to the community. My sense is that that is what works. That, what worked for the squatter movement, I think, was that any time there would be an eviction or an attempt to evict a building, there would be a whole lot of resistance to that. And it could come in many different forms from many different people. Sometimes it was organized, sometimes it was spontaneous, but there was a lot of it. And so even though, there were a lot of situations where it would seem like we lost, like they evicted the building, they dispersed the people got their heads beat in, what we were also doing was establishing that any time the city evicted a building, they had an expense involved in that. They expended money, they expended political capital, they looked bad in front of people because they had to send all these cops out. They went through a long process. And at a certain point, they said, okay, we're going to cut a deal with people, and they did. They cut the deal very quietly. There were about 3 years in which nobody was allowed to say this was going on, and then, around 2000, it became official and public that they were legalizing the squats in the Lower East Side. And that's, what victory looks like is, that there will be a concession, and they'll try to put the best face on that concession they can. So I think that that's really what gets results. I think it can be very frustrating trying to do a type of overt above-ground politics where you say we want to elect someone who will do the right thing, or we want to put a revolutionary party in charge who will do the right thing, and that's very hard to do. But another way to go about it is to, create continuous pressure over specific things you want or don't want, and to make it very hard to do the things you don't want done, and, much easier to do the things you do want done, and to kind of condition the state the way you would train a dog. It's like, the dog does something wrong, you smack it with a newspaper until the dog starts to associate the newspaper with what they did, and then they stop doing it. And the state can be treated very much the same way. And that's, I think, what people discovered, or what people found through this action, is that they were able to get certain results, not so much by trying to infiltrate the political system, but by trying to condition the political system and give it rewards and punishment for the proper behavior. Mm-hmm. And I think that was an effective tactic. It's certainly not the only approach. I'm very impressed with the Bernie Sanders movement. I never expected them to get as far as they did, but I'm not surprised they didn't manage to make Bernie president. I never thought they would be able to do that. And you don't have to wait to get somebody in the White House to get things you need done. Mm-hmm. You can get things done by direct pressure. In fact, that's very often the only way you can get things done anyway.
Definitely. And on that same topic of autonomy, I wanted to ask you about, you spoke about the time you had a wire put around your neck and a neighbor helped you.
Oh, wow. That's an old story. Where'd you pick that one up?
I don't know. I think maybe from reading some other interviews or something. I listened to a lot of
that goes back to my earliest experiences in the Lower East Side, which is when I moved here, that we had a lot of crime on this block. We had a big drug dealing operation, and also a lot of people who were there to buy drugs who were not particularly responsible towards other people, and a real sense of, danger in the block. And I, at one point, was walking up the street, and somebody came up behind me and put a wire around my neck, was, I guess, trying to rob me. And somebody appeared in front of them. He put his, hand in his pocket, said, "I'm an off-duty cop, and I've got a gun in my pocket, and I'll give you till 3 to get out of here." And that person turned out to be not an off-duty cop, but my upstairs neighbor. And that is something that I learned about in this neighborhood, that the people who lived here took care of each other, and, you know, as people became aware that you were part of the neighborhood and you were taken care of, you became less of a target of this type of harassment.
Yeah, it seems, and this also comes through in War in the Neighborhood, this whole thing of mutual aid, like people helping each other out in these on these squat buildings. And
that was essential because what we had then, pre-internet age, right, is we had a phone tree, the list of those people who were willing to come out during an eviction. We also restricted who could have access to the phone tree so that it wouldn't be used irresponsibly, because we had a few instances where somebody called the phone tree for something that wasn't an emergency or wasn't a real problem, so that we selected certain people who were trusted to have a copy of the phone tree. If there were an eviction going on, people with the phone tree, I think we had a system where at least two of those people would have to agree that it was time to activate the phone tree. So we'd have to call each other. If you found out there was something, you'd have to call at least one other people of the committee that had the list and say, okay, this is pretty serious. Okay, so we'll now split up the list. You will call part, and I will call part. And then you each call your part of the list. And this would get people out into the street, and all of a sudden the police would be looking at a big crowd of people standing around the building where they were trying to do an eviction. And very often we would be able to call lawyers or paralegals who would show up, and that would have a huge effect on the activity of the police. Just have someone show up and present their card and say, I'm a lawyer, what's going on? Make a very big difference in their behavior. And have media show up, all of that. And that very often prevented people from getting evicted. And so that was essential to the squatter movement in the 1980s and 90s, was the ability to kind of call everybody up like the Minutemen, you know, in the Revolutionary Wars, just get everybody out there in a minute. And I think, you know, the potential to do that today is much greater with the Internet and ought to be used more, you know, the ability to just call everybody someplace right away, you know, and to have community support for someone. You know, and I think in a lot of ways that we were prefigurative of what people do today with social media. You know, that those ideas have continued in certain ways. Like a friend of mine went into the hospital for something, and her cell phone was broken, and I think she put that out on Facebook, and a guy showed up and gave her a cell phone. You know,
wow.
So, you know, like, and it's not like it's something that went away. It's something that has taken on new forms.
Awesome. And so in War in the Neighborhood, Jesus confronts an undercover cop. I was wondering, have you ever had to deal with agent provocateurs or informants that were trying to sabotage movements? Well, you know, the real difficulty is that, you know, I've always found this, that if somebody doesn't like a behavior, the easiest way to discredit that behavior is to say the person who's doing that must be agent provocateur or an undercover cop. And you really don't know that, but you do know that the behavior you think is a bad behavior. You know, so that it might be, in a lot of cases, easier to simply talk about why that's a bad behavior. I know that we were at certain points surveilled. I know that actually homeless people from the shelter would tell us that the police came to the shelters and offered them money to spy on us. So we knew this was going on. The extent to which it's going on is very hard to nail down. You know, there are some people who have, you know, been publicly accused of being police agents for years who continue to be in the neighborhood, and who knows if they really are, you know. It's very hard to say. I think the real question is, what do you think is a good way to handle the situation, you know, and figure out what that is, you know. Definitely. Have you all ever done a FOIA request or anything on that time area?
I haven't. I wonder if anyone has. That would be interesting to find out.
Yeah, it'd be good for research and stuff for sure. I wanted to talk maybe about community solidarity and resistance in relation to Black Lives Matter and then the past killings of Eleanor. bumpers and Michael Stewart.
Okay, sure. Let's talk about that. When I was in my 20s, we heard about this guy, Michael Stewart. I went to Pratt Institute, didn't finish for art. I lived in the Lower East Side. I worked in all kinds of odd jobs at a movie theater, bussing tables. You know, those were the types of jobs we had back then. Michael Stewart, I think, had also gone to Pratt Institute, and he worked at the Pyramid Club. He didn't live in the Lower East Side. I believe he lived in Brooklyn. He was a black kid, young person who was aspiring to be an artist, and he was killed by the police. He was strangled to death by 11 transit cops. There was a lot of outrage in our community, and I definitely felt like the only real difference between me and Michael Stewart was that he was black, and that's the reason that happened to him. And I remember that Stewart's girlfriend tried to organize all of us to go up to Harlem to this congressional hearing on police brutality that was taking place in Harlem. Sabrina Jones and I got together and painted a couple of signs to carry up there. And then when we went up there, we found that nobody else in the Lower East Side had gone up there. You know, none of our white friends from downtown had gone up there, and we were sort of the only white people in the room. And, of course, the security took the signs away from us immediately. And so we were penned into this balcony that had a wire mesh separating us from the Congress people who were holding this hearing. And at this hearing, one person after another got up and described what was basically casual police brutality through the course of their everyday lives, not just police murders, but just daily having to deal with, police, either roughing them up or threatening them or always being in their lives in a certain way. And I became conscious that whereas for us this was a strange event, this was this one-time thing, this kid Michael Stewart gets killed, for a lot of black people this was an everyday event. This was the fabric of their lives, that police were constantly a threat and constantly a danger. So I became aware at that point that this was really a problem. So, back there in the first half of the 1980s, started working with anti-police brutality groups, particularly the December 12th Coalition, which was the real force behind what's called the Days of Outrage, which is, what made Al Sharpton famous, was this shutting down the subways and shutting down various transit lines through mass civil disobedience to protest the killing of young black people and even older black people, such as Eleanor Bumpers. So this has been a problem that's just an ongoing problem. I mean, the list of people is very long and gets longer every week. The American police force just can't seem to stop killing black people. And this has been consistent for 30 years, I think that something that's changed is, first, the availability of video in the 90s, that it became more and more possible for people to videotape their own lives, that equipment became less expensive. And oddly, people believe a videotape where they don't believe an eyewitness. So that, black people were saying for years that this happened to them, and white people were not believing it. And in fact, when we went up to Harlem or down to Brooklyn to be part of the anti-police brutality demonstrations in the 80s and 90s, a lot of our white friends thought that we were doing something very strange, that we were motivated by some kind of white guilt, that why would we do such a thing, And this was even true of some of our more progressive friends, or that you have a thing against the police, you hate the police, all this sort of stuff. Whereas as people have been able to document this stuff with video of various types, it's become clear to people that, wow, there really is a problem here and it's consistent, and so I think that people don't dismiss those allegations in the same way they used to. So I don't know if that will lead to some progress on it. Maybe it will. It's a very frustrating issue because, at this point, like if Michael Stewart had lived, he'd be an old guy with gray hair now. Mm-hmm. And we're still dealing with the same problem. So that's a very frustrating thing to me as an older person, that we have not been able to make one dent in this thing. It just keeps going. But I do think there's a much broader consciousness about it because of the videos.
Thank you. So my last question is, so one of your first stencils was about the invasion of Grenada.
Mm-hmm. That was my first stencil.
That was your first, okay. So I was wondering, have you seen the increase of empire since your first piece? And what's your analysis now of that?
Thinking about, so we're talking here about American foreign policy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, American foreign policy has been about dominating other countries in order to support the interests of multinational finance capital and get them the deals they want. Oddly enough, not necessarily in the interest of the nation state of the United States. For instance, the United States pushes trade deals on the world, which are not to the benefit of people here to a large extent, but they're to the benefit of capital formations that are still to some extent based in the United States, although they're becoming more international. So in the 70s and 80s, we had what was the remains of the Cold War, the fight with the Soviet Union, which was pushing a somewhat different form of economic organization that they felt competed with capitalism. So they needed to defeat that and to bring those countries into the capitalist system, which they eventually did. You had the attempt to intervene in Grenada and Nicaragua to try to make those countries accept the capitalist model, which we've now promoted for everyone in the world, that everyone should be capitalist, that India should be capitalist, that China should be capitalist. And we're now dealing with the results of India being capitalist and China being capitalist, that capitalism requires a continually expanding economy because it has to produce profits, which means a percentage of the economy is being continually skimmed off. So if you're not going to have massive privation, you have to have continuous expansion just so that you can get that percentage off the top. So that means a continually expanding economic base in India and China, which have huge populations. And so we've got an expansion that threatens the entire environment, the entire ecological system. Now all of a sudden, we used to be afraid of China because they were communists. Now we're afraid of China because they're capitalists. We were afraid of Russia because they were communists. Now we're afraid of them because they're capitalists and they want to take over our markets. Big surprise. I and most of my friends started out politically by being opposed to U.S. militarism and U.S. intervention overseas and the attempt of Reagan to get us back into a military posture around the world. As we worked on that, we found that there was more and more about our immediate environment that, seemed to come to our attention. And that in a lot of ways, the international posturing of the United States was a way of distracting from the domestic posturing of the United States, where the situation of people in this country has been deteriorating for, at this point, more than a generation. And we're now starting to see that with, the foreclosure crisis that took place about 8 years ago. Lenin said that imperialism is when a country exports capital. Well, the capital is now being exported from China to the United States, so that, in a way, one might view the American population as becoming the victim of a type of economic imperialism. So that's complicated. We still have this exaggerated military posture around the world, but we actually don't have an economy that supports it. So, in a certain way, the American society is being hollowed out. We're fracking gas all over the country for export, and that apparently the land in the United States is so worthless it can be ground up and turned into fuel and made unlivable. And that then we have this very weird economic model that's developed where it seems like you can have abandonment and crime, or you can have gentrification and essentially selling the land to an international upper middle class and forcing everyone who's born in the area out, or you can just grind up the area and turn it into fuel. Those are the only forms of development we seem to have in the United States now. So this is, this is a really ugly and kind of short-term situation. There's going to have to be some other way of running the society that develops, because this is going to burn itself out very quickly.
Yeah. I was even thinking about recently how capitalism dispossesses things, and now everyone's broke, so they just open up their house with Airbnb to make money, or they turn their car into a Lyft or an Uber, and just encroaches more on people's things.
All right, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Thanks again for tuning into the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Please support Seth Tobocman and his work. Please share the podcast and Patreon around and rate the show if you can. I have some more awesome guests lined up. If you have any suggestions, please send me an email. And thanks again to Awareness for the music.